I'm Sherry. I work here in Santa Cruz for Veterans for Peace, which is the primary sponsor of this event. Veterans for Peace National has been very supportive of us. We have a local committee called Armistice 100, which is working on, this is the 100th anniversary year of Armistice. And we have many, many co-sponsors who work with us and partner with us, and that's really valuable for us. Particularly here, the Resource Center for Nonviolence. This is Peter. Peter's on staff here and has been for decades. So wonderful resource.
Speak up.
Yes. Me.
Yeah. Issues.
Okay. So obviously this is a wonderful resource for the community, and we really appreciate the partnership of our CNV on this weekend with David Swanson making the space available to us, and especially their awesome mailing list that they get the word out to that helps have people know what we're doing. And this is really exciting, I think, for many of us who were here last night for David's presentation, because except for, how about raising hands? There are a handful of people who were here last night. Yeah.
A big handful.
And then we've got a whole new group of people, and that's so exciting to see that in the room. And so I'm going to turn it over to, Rico? Okay. Changing up our order here. Rico, Veterans for Peace, and it's going to start us off with a bell that was made out of a military shell, a transformational moment.
So this is a symbolic bell that was once used to hurt people, and now it rings a beautiful bell. So we love this symbolism, and it turns out to be a very good bell too. So let's just listen to it, and if you want, send out the message to everybody that you know about peace. That's really why we're here. Thank you very much for being here.
Good morning, I'm Tatanka, and before we introduced David Swanson, who last night had his focus on the abolition of war as an institution. We're going to continue that conversation, how it affects our lives. We want to open with gratitude for the Ohlone people for being here, and just a short invocation where we're calling in. It's not just us, we have our ancestors, we have our guides, so we're grateful to Great Spirit for all the worlds of Grandmother Earth, the mineral world, the plant world, the animal world, and the human world. And we welcome all those unseen spirits and forces of peace, disarmament, nonviolence, and war abolitionists. I hope. I'd like to first introduce, to lead us off with a song, two songs maybe. This is Danny Paul Nelson. He's a full-time organizer with the Romero Institute. He spent a good deal of time in the Dakotas. I hope he'll say just a moment about that. And he's like David Swanson, he's a tireless organizer. And the Romero Institute is named after Archbishop Romero, who was assassinated by our CIA giving Holy Communion in El Salvador in the early 80s. And a very special time for him because tomorrow the Romero Institute is having a celebration because Pope Francis is canonizing Archbishop Romero, which is a big thing south of the border. This is a man who stood up for the poor and spoke out about it, and they took his life for it. So thank you for being with us, Danny Paul. Lead us on.
The event tomorrow is 4 to 6:30, by the way, up here at Holy Cross Church. So that the social hall, if you're available at that time, we'd love to have you with us. There's going to be Salvadoran food, and Tatanka will be part of the program as well.
Speak up so they can all hear you.
So I just want to say a couple words. I want to mention how important it is to me as perhaps a younger person, compared to most of you, to be part of this community. I feel like you all provide a lot of leadership in Santa Cruz for the progressive movement, and you know, we have to stick together. We don't always feel like the majority, but we have to keep showing up. You know, and I see that in this group of people. Tatanka has been like an uncle to me, a good friend. Claire and Rico have been good friends of ours at the Romero Institute now for a long time, about a decade. And you know, without this kind of constant showing up, I think we wouldn't be able to make the kind of progress that we need to make. And of course, you never know when the breakthroughs are going to happen. It's only by kind of continuing that drumbeat of activism that eventually you have those big breakthroughs. So I feel that we're on the precipice of something good, despite how dark it looks at the national level at the moment. And David, I just want to say, nice to meet you.
You too.
Thank you for coming to see us in Santa Cruz and to bring your vision. I'm going to play just 2 songs. The first one is about homelessness. I wrote this song probably 8 years ago about a woman that I saw at the post office here in Santa Cruz. It's about the policy of housing first, where you give homes to people first instead of demanding that they change their lives around before you provide them the basic necessities. That's the foundation for making the changes that they need to make. But I'd love for you to sing along with me on the chorus. It's just housing first, to get you on real quick. Standing post office line, I saw something that I'd never seen before. A woman, somebody's baby girl. She looked so bad, she'd been living on the street. She was a human being, yeah. Nobody said anything. Just stood there like we didn't see her. What are we scared of? That there's a woman who needs help. Why can't we see? Makes no sense to me, housing first. But let's give someone a home. Housing first. This country is rich enough for sure. Housing first. But let's live a little on faith. Housing first. Let's not be cheapskates. Standing in the gas station, I saw something that I'd never seen before. 3 little boys in a car with their mama. Yeah, that's where they sleep. Nobody did anything. Just stood there like we didn't see them. What are we scared of? This family needs help. Why can't we see? Oh no, it makes no sense to me, housing first. Let's give someone a home. Housing first. This country is rich enough for sure. Housing first. Let's live a little on faith. Housing first. Let's not be cheapskates. The sun may fall to the ground. The sea may swallow us whole. This world may run out of patience unless we rock and roll. First. This country is rich enough for sure. Housing first. Let's live a little on faith. Housing first. Let's not be cheapskates. Oh, yeah. Housing first. And this, as Tatanka mentioned, is about the work that we do in the Dakotas. So I think when I was 32, so maybe 6 years ago, I went to Standing Rock to help produce a summit down in Rapid City in South Dakota about foster care and adoption because of the epidemic of Lakota youth being taken from their families by the Department of Social Services and then placed into non-native settings. So it really is a slow genocide. It's been going on for a long time. I think 40–50% of the kids in foster care in the Dakotas are all native. And that's true on reservations around the country. So I did that work in 2012 with some amazing activists who were based at Standing Rock. So when the movement began in 2016, we happened to be very close with a lot of, the folks who were behind that movement too, because the same activists do all the good stuff out there, as you can imagine. It's only about 100,000 people in the Lakota community in the South and North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, that whole region. So there's a few usual suspects. One of them is Phyllis Young, and she was the kind of camp liaison at the Ocheti Sakoi camp in 2016 and 2017. She's an amazing woman. Anyhow, she was my partner back in 2012, so I wrote the song in 2014 before the movement began, but it ended up being quite appropriate for given what happened. And I'll just mention, because Tatanka asked me to, that we've been providing legal defense for certain water protectors at Standing Rock. And Chase Iron Eyes was our client, and he's an attorney, former congressional candidate from North Dakota, he was providing vision and leadership to the effort, and he got arrested and targeted, and was looking at potentially 6 years of prison time, but we were able to get his charges dropped with support from a lot of people. So this song is called Lakota Blues. There's no hook to sing along with, but I'm moving down this long and windy road. Another name and face that I don't know. I feel like Moses, I ain't got no home, but I can't complain about being a rolling stone. And my song goes out like a prayer. Am I wrong? It's trying to make things fair. The state of North Dakota lost its soul. Who knows where? Come on out to Standing Rock, I'll meet you there. There's an April storm pouring down snow, and I'm driving in my beat-up Volvo. I head down to the old casino, yeah, to get these Indian kids back who got stole. And my song goes out like a prayer. Am I wrong? Think this world's absurd. The white man wanted everything too bad. They took his word. I let this Dakota song be sung and heard. 700 children each and every year, sent to Christian homes and raised on sin and fear. You can fill an ocean bottom with all the blood and tears. But don't you think it's time that we hear? In the kitchen, she told me how her son had his kids taken, yeah, and they died of a broken heart because he missed them. She shed a tear and didn't speak another word, and into my mind an image burned of a people whose children and land should be returned. This old Lakota song has been sung and heard. Yeah. Oh no. Oh no. I look forward to experiencing this workshop with you all, and I've got some CDs. If anybody wants me, just hold your hand up. I'm not selling them. I'll just give them away.
Oh. Thank you. Well, Steve, are you ready to lead us in a Sing along? No. Okay. So maybe we'll do one at the end. We figured that would be good at the end, right? And we don't need a guitar for it. We can all vocal, you know. We shall overcome. Let's do that at the end. While he's passing them out, we not only have David Swanson here, we have David Hartsoe, and who is such a blessing. His book is out here as well. And I was reminded last night, looking around the room, this is my pitch for you to buy all these books. It's not just for us. I have given David books to all my kids. All my grandkids have been read stories from his books by my kids, okay? We need, the next time David Swanson comes back, we'll find somebody for you to debate, okay? And we want to have at least half the people in the room, young people, right? Yeah. So our goal will be half young people, and if we want to look like Santa Cruz County, we have to have about half brown and black faces and half white faces, right? So that's our goal for the next time he comes out. We're going to have an age mix, and we're going to have a gender mix, and we're going to have an ethnic mix. Okay.
Good goal.
So, yeah. So buy the books, give them away. Give them to your children. Give them to your grandchildren. And the only thing I'll do to introduce David this morning, we had longer introductions last night, is the chutzpah to go out and give me your best shot from the Army, from the Naval Academy, and he will debate the existence of a just war and have them justify have David explain that there is an alternative, and that in fact it is more harm than anybody realizes, and there's no such thing as a just war. Just as there is really no such justification for war itself as an institution. So thank you for being here. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all. Let me know if you can't hear me okay. Thank you for yesterday and for today and for everything you're doing year in and year out for peace. I would add to the book's pitch, give them to your elected misrepresentatives. So I think I know what kind of a room I'm in, but I want to find out in some detail. There are people who believe and will tell you that every war is always justified. And there are people who will tell you no war is ever justified. And there are people in a third group who will tell you some wars are justified and necessary and others are not. So I want to, by a show of hands, see which groups we're in. So all wars are always justified. Raise your hand. Okay. Group number 2. No wars are ever justified. Raise your hand. Okay. We're not in the normal United States population. Some wars are sometimes justified and others not. Raise your hand.
I have just come out of that recently.
Raise them really high if you're still in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot. You don't have to say a word here if you don't want to, but this is on the interactive workshop, and I'm going to try to get other people to do a lot of the talking, not just me. I have, as was mentioned, been doing public debates with people who I can get to do public debates to defend the position that so many people have, that some wars are justified. And we poll at the beginning and at the end, and always a lot of people have moved in the direction of no wars are justified, which means that if it's not just screaming and calling names, and it's not the stuff we see on television, but it's a respectful discussion, don't even have to call it a debate, but an attempt to find out without prejudging whether I can be convinced of your point of view or you of mine, but let's share enough information that one or the other happens. One or the other tends to happen. And so I would love it if someone who had their hand up for some wars are sometimes justified, to give us a few of your main reasons why you say that. Anybody want to raise their hand for that?
I can say something.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, does this mean that that a lot of people in the room say that the American Revolution was not justified?
Yeah. No wars means no wars. I believe it's pretty clear.
But when you're using justified, you're not using it in terms of just war theory. You're using it justified in what terms?
Morally justified, something that you can morally defend as something that ought to have been done. In your understanding of ethics and morality, and so is that a reason why you raised your? Did you even raise your hand?
Well, I'm stuck in an existential bind, which is that my father was a prisoner of war of the Japanese in Thailand in the Second World War, and he was just towards what we know is now the end of the war in July. He was being shipped out to Japan as slave labor because they were short of labor. And everyone knew that what that meant is they would be worked to death and they wouldn't be fed. And so he would have died. And then bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that order was stayed to move them out. And so he eventually got back to the UK, and I was born 9 months later. So I'm the existential bind I'm in, is that the dropping of those bombs allowed me to be born.
No. Okay, I hear a lot of people willing to reply, which is what I was going to hope for. And a reply can be a point of argument or a question, or how would you reply to that to persuade someone that war is actually not justified?
Well, I'm not sure I can do the whole thing, but the bombing was done for the Soviet Union. The bombing was done to prevent the Russians from reaching Japan and winning the war. The United States wanted to take credit for winning the Second World War, so they dropped those horrible bombs. But
that wasn't his point.
No, I know, and that's why I said I can't answer the whole thing. Somebody else should take it.
Okay, some other hands. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just stepping back and observing that we all have a story that we're in. That's the way we look at things in our story. And so if you're looking at one side of the story or another, there's multiple points of view, just like we're sitting around a circle. But war is not justified because we have different stories or points of view.
Okay, we're trying to persuade him, not me.
I'm talking to you directly, not your story.
I definitely think it has to do with at what point we're talking about. So if we're talking about the run-up to a war, there are alternatives to it becoming a war. Once it's become a war, I should surely say that I am, all my parents' families were killed in the Holocaust. So of course at that point, maybe war was necessary to undo what was going on, although we know about the ships kept away and all of that. But what I was trying to say is it's about the prevention of war in the first place, that there are alternatives, that we don't have to go to war in the first place. There shouldn't have been a war in the first place because of all the things that could have been done.
So this is, if I can add a comment, this is a start of one of the good points that I was hoping someone would make, which is, of course, if World War II had not happened, your father would not have been a prisoner of war in World War II. So the fact that horrible things like being a prisoner of war in World War II were part of World War II is not actually an argument that World War II was a good thing. It's actually an argument that World War II was a horrible thing, right? Somebody else want to try? Yeah.
I'd like to shift the focus maybe a little bit. That I was torn between the group of some are and none are. And the problem that I'm having with this is I feel that dwelling in the past
is counterproductive or can be counterproductive. The focus should be, are future wars justifiable? And I think that's a different question. And I'm not sure that looking back, possibly getting into conflict with different stories, if you will. Why? I mean,
well, this is a very important and excellent point. There isn't any other institution in our society or in any other society that reaches back 75 years to find the most recent justifiable example. You know, there have been constant, thousands of wars constantly for the past 75 years. And almost everyone who seeks to justify our single biggest public expense, the biggest thing we do as a society, goes back 75 years to find the most recent example of it. So what is it about war that, or what is it about that war 75 years ago that suggests that some war next week or next month might be justifiable despite the past 75 years of wars that everybody agrees are not justifiable?
I guess my point was that my turning point was, I think I read it from Ken Wilber, who made this statement, and it might not have been original, that war is obsolete. And that's my perspective now. And to talk about other wars, I don't understand what good that does, because trying to convince someone that future wars were unjustifiable by showing me one that was justifiable. I mean,
right.
It's from a reality perspective.
If people were to recognize that the world today does not have colonialism, does not have Nazism in the sense of Nazi Germany, does not has nuclear bombs, which didn't exist back then, has an understanding of the tools of nonviolence that absolutely didn't exist in the 1940s. Like, today's world has almost nothing in common with the world of the 1940s. And so if you cannot care whether World War II was justified or not and proceed with the clear understanding that war can never be justified from this point forward, then we can drop the obsession with World War II. But given that most people I have found utterly incapable of that mental feat, and that US culture is saturated from birth through cartoons, video games, textbooks, movies, dramas, t-shirts, with the glorification of World War II as the origin myth of our culture, I've found that in fact you do have to explain to people that World War II wasn't justified, which I'm, you know, but yeah, go ahead.
So, directly responding to you, without looking in the past and understanding that your individual life and hundreds of thousands of people leveled by a bomb are both the victims of not preventing that war, then you put yourself seemingly in a position of being, you know, trying to justify your existence, and almost it's the exceptionalism that David talked about last night. Well, hundreds of thousands of people died so I could be born. I mean, it's crazy making. The point is that that war needn't have ever happened if we understand. And if we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it. I'm just reminded of the book David Harris wrote on the Vietnam War. He said, we never came to terms. We never come to terms with Native Americans, with slavery. We just don't come to terms with it as a society. And what happens is the right says, yeah, Vietnam War was a mistake. We didn't nuke them. And the left says the war is a mistake. It never should have happened. We all agree, so we're going to repeat it. So the path, it's really important. I mean, I have such appreciation. I didn't know that this nation made war illegal. There's a lot of things I didn't know about our history. I didn't know the strength of the peace movement in the 20s, for instance.
Okay, so there are a number of, I think, key points that have not yet quite been made to make the effect, what I consider, in my humble opinion, the most effective case to someone who has this perspective. If you think you can do it, raise your hand.
Over here.
Is that over here?
Well, was Harper's Ferry, John Brown's uprising, was that justified? That was a mini-war. How about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising? Was that a mini-war? Is the Intifada uprising, is that a mini-war? Is the Little Bighorn, that was a mini war with, you know, resistance, self-defense. Is that justified? That's all I have to say.
Okay, that is a very, very important and enormous question that maybe we can come to in 3 minutes if we address this one first. I was going to try to get them in sequence. Did anybody want to speak further to this initial?
Well, I'm thinking more about what you said than maybe what you said, which is that I think existentially we are all intimately tied into war. And I mean, my personal story, my father was a technician in the Manhattan Project, but even now, you know, just whatever our beliefs are, whatever books we've written, whatever ways that we participate in this society, we are existentially a part of war, I think. And I also was thinking of your point, but I think nonviolent struggle is not the same thing as war. I think that's what you're looking for.
I would maybe make 3 points that I think are important, and then go to this small justified rebellion, mini wars are justified question. And those are, first of all, World War II was, as Winston Churchill said, the most avoidable war ever. The idiotic way of ending World War I that had smart people predicting World War II on the spot, the ongoing militarization, the funding of the Nazis as preferable to the commies, the buildup of weapons, all the steps that clearly led to war and were observed as leading to war were choices. It didn't have to be taken. There's not some magical or physical or historical force that compels people to do these stupid things. Second, I would say, raise your hand if Evian means anything to you.
The water?
Yeah, besides the water. One person. Yeah, besides water and besides naive backwards. Because this is going to be naive forwards. Are you lowering your hand?
I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
What does Evian mean? The word E-V-I-A-N, Evian. It means water. So it means naive forwards, and it means the town in France where the water comes from and gets put in the stupid plastic bottles. But it also means the most famous of the conferences where the governments of the world gathered together to debate and discuss and negotiate who would accept the Jews. Because what did the insane Nazis want to do with the Jews for many years before they wanted to kill them?
Ship them out.
Ship them out. And what did the people, led by the United States government, with hundreds of journalists in the room, big public event, decide to do with the Jews?
Keep them out.
Refuse to accept them anywhere on earth. And why? Why? Publicly stated by the representatives of the world's democracies.
Not enough ships to carry.
No?
No.
Racism.
Because they're Jews, because they're a dirty, evil, stinking race of people that we don't want. The representative from the wonderful nation of Australia said, if you can believe it or not, Australia doesn't have a racial problem. Why would we import one? Right? The one place that wanted to import the Jews was the dictator of the Dominican Republic, who thought the Jews were preferable to his largely African-American population. They were all universally racists, with the majority racist backing of their publics back home. And what did Hitler do after this conference? He said, look at these hypocrites. They want me to stop abusing the Jews, but they won't take them because they know I'm right. And I'll put them on luxury cruise ships and send them anywhere, and they won't have them. And then you had Kristallnacht and so forth. And through the course of the war, this is to address this myth that after the war was begun, it was justifiable to continue it because... Excuse me?
What year was it?
39 maybe? I mean, it's publicly available information. I don't remember. and so through the course of the war, you had the peace advocates going to the US government and the British government and saying, take the Jews and the other targeted victims, as many non-Jews as Jews, out of Germany. And they wouldn't do it, had zero interest in it. It became a selling point for World War II only after World War II was over. The third point I would make, and this was begun by someone else, is that out of I think 8 5-star US generals at the time of World War II, 7 of them said, most of them privately within the US government, said there was no need, don't do it, don't drop nukes on Japan. And the motive discussed by Truman and the Secretary of State was indeed to send a message to the Soviet Union before the Soviet invasion, which is of course what actually ended the war, weeks after the nuclear bombings, which didn't end the war. Now, the nuclear bombings saved some people's lives. That's wonderful. Everything bad has good effects, and everything good has bad effects. The world is not simple. But the bombs killed hundreds of thousands of people with no real justification and no good motivation. And Truman went on the radio and lied about it immediately. And the myth that somehow this saved lives more than it took lives remains a myth that is highly damaging. So what about this other perspective that we get from peace advocates, from leftists, from anti-imperialists? What about the good anti-imperial, anti-oppressive wars for liberation, wars for good causes by distant people? Well, what about that kind of, what would you reply to that kind of argument for justifying war?
Doesn't work.
What do you mean it doesn't work?
The few instances I can think of where that might have been offered as a reason didn't pan out. Libya, Iraq, they didn't bring democracy. And it's not happening in Afghanistan. So wars are not fought for freedom and democracy. The people who fight wars do not fight them for freedom and democracy. They fight them to save their own lives and their comrades' lives and fellows' lives. So it doesn't work.
Sure, okay, 1, 2, 3.
There's an alternative. Chenoweth, is that the name? Who can speak?
That's the same.
Studied nonviolent resistance and wars of violent resistance, and showed that the fact of using violence meant that the objectives of the war reproduce that violence, both afterwards, and the alternative of nonviolent resistance is much more effective. So there is an alternative.
Yeah, that was what.
Okay, we had a third hand.
That's what I was going to say.
Well, that is a very, very good point. The work put together by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who've published books and articles, looked at many, many cases over the past 100 years of resistance to oppression, mostly domestic oppression, tyranny, but in several cases foreign occupation, and looked at what's more likely to succeed, campaigns that are principally violent or campaigns that are principally nonviolent, that are publicly committed to nonviolence, dedicated to nonviolence. Maybe there are some exceptions marginally, but use nonviolence. Which is more likely to succeed? And not only are the nonviolent campaigns by no means guaranteed to succeed, but over twice as likely to succeed statistically. But those successes are many times longer lasting than successes through violence. Why do you think nonviolent campaigns are more likely to succeed?
Well, they seem more likely to succeed in the longer term, but I'm not so sure about the shorter term, and that would be the question I ask. And our friend over here in the window, I can't see very well, brought up situations in which people seemed as if they had no other alternative but to respond. And I would ask, did the Sandinistas have any alternative but to respond to the CIA? And then it dawned on me that what is a war? Can we ask that question before we continue talking about war? Because indeed, were the American indigenous Indian people at war, or were they simply protecting their homes? So I'd ask, what is the common definition we have for war?
Yeah, well, a general definition for most purposes is large, organized mass violence, mass murder by a major group organized collectively to work on that project. This is what militaries do. This is what the militaries of states do and the militaries of non-state groups do.
But is the victim of that organization at war?
Well, one answer to that would be that depends on whether the victim chooses to be at war. Certainly the victim of a war is by definition the victim of a war. Is the victim of a war engaged in warfare? I think this is the question at hand. Should they choose to be engaged in warfare? I think it's a clear choice. So I don't know if you're remotely beginning to be persuaded of anything, but what a lot of people push back on this with is, how dare you rich white American people in the heart of the empire decree to us what rights we have and don't have to respond to your evil government? How dare thou? How would you reply to that?
I'm not hearing the economic aspect in this discussion, and I want to say that if you look at those instances of violence or resistance, a lot of that stemmed from economic inequality and a necessity to claim the ability to make a living and to be treated with respect and economic justice, essentially. And so I think that is actually more than the causes of war that you were talking about. I have to disagree that war is for the causes that you mentioned. I'm trying to remember what they were, but they did not have to do with economic justice.
He was referring to individual soldiers. You're referring to the people who start wars.
Individual soldiers get caught up in wars that are fought for economic advantage for someone.
Yes.
And who that someone is usually weapons manufacturers. I'm with Code Pink, and we have a huge campaign around this, and David's part of it, and you probably are too. But I really believe that wars can be avoided altogether, and these sort of resistance movements that feel they have to take up arms like the Sandinistas, if they had economic security and they had economic justice in their own countries. And so I would say, if I'm in that position, that I'd work for that economic security instead of taking up arms.
Yeah.
Because that's what's going to make peace. And you don't have to fight the United States, which is a crazy idea. Look what we do.
So what do you say to the position of a wonderful anti-war group, UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition, which is that you have no right to say a word to the people of the Philippines or the people of Colombia about whether they use violence or not. That's up to them. How dare you? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I was at that UNAC conference in Virginia.
Yeah, it's not the answer I'm looking for.
No. But it was overwhelmingly horrible what I was hearing.
I don't have an answer to your question. I'm wondering if there'd be a problem with pulling those shades down. We are, it's very...
I know how to do it.
Is that all right though for other people?
That's the same question people bring up after a place like Ferguson. And people tell them, why are you breaking your own window in your own town? And so that leads me to never want to criticize the aggrieved. That it's up to the aggrieved people how they want to respond to the situation, not me.
Yeah, that's great.
So I'll tell you. So when we get to my turn, I'll tell you how I respond to this.
My simple answer from my experience with organizing, watching Occupy, arguing that, anyway, is that the forces of violence know how to handle violence. They want to make us violent. Most people of the world, especially people who are oppressed, do not want to commit violence if there's any other alternative. Most of the people will support an organized effort of people that are clearly nonviolent. Most people don't want to support an effort that's violent because they intuitively know it's just going to create more violence. So my life experience as an organizer and having to ferret out in draft resistance, and farm workers, and Amnesty International, and cause after cause, is all those provocateurs sent among us to provoke us to that more radical than now position, because that is easily controlled by the forces of violence, easily crushed. So it's much more difficult to crush an organized nonviolent movement.
Okay, we'll take a couple more people, and if nobody touches on what I think are the key points here, I'll tell you what I think they are.
You've asked a bunch of good questions. Several questions back was what makes nonviolent resistance more powerful? And Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan in their book, Why Civil Resistance Works, say that even a little violence in a nonviolent movement scares people away. And a very key thing in what makes movements work.
Loudly.
A very key thing in what makes movements work is how many people are involved. And they say that if you get at least 3.5% of the population, it's nowhere that a nonviolent movement has not been successful. And I mean, probably all of us know that if we know there's violence there and we have small kids or we're old and have a cane and so on, we're not going to go. And so I'd say to anybody that is considering violence as a means of struggle, or at least allowing some violence, you can scare people away and then you're going to just get defeated. So if you're interested in winning, it's important to really keep a very clear nonviolent discipline. And to choose nonviolence as your means of struggle. The other thing that I would say is that we haven't really talked about is the moral question. I mean, in your book, War is a Lie. Governments have to lie to their people to get them to support the war.
Right.
And I believe we're all brothers and sisters around the world. Whether you're American or Russian or Iranian or Japanese or anybody else, we're all related and life is precious. You know, to kill somebody because you don't like their government, or you know, they're a different color or religion or ideology. I mean, who wants to kill other people just because they're different, they're a communist or they're somebody else? Our governments have to...
A good number of people, and we're trying to reply to their position in a way that persuades.
But I think it's based on the lies.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That we've been taught. They are inhuman. They are vermin. They are...
For sure.
They're dispensable.
Let's take
and
maybe
more important
two more people on this topic. Very good points.
I think part of that persuasion has got to involve our active relationships of trust with people who are oppressed in situations of struggle, and it's not just an intellectual convincing that's not going to work because of our situation.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, but let's say.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that. The idea that you can't attract people if there's going to be a hint of violence, and that implies that you have someplace to hide. So if you have a nice place and you just stay home that day, great for you. But some people in the streets don't. Right. And if they go outside, they get shot, you know, in this country. And so how do you answer that?
Yeah. These are very difficult questions, and people come from very different perspectives like this. And I think the first thing is to make clear to people that we're not instructing them what they should do, what they need to do. We want to sit down and respectfully hear from them and possibly learn from them and discuss with them what they they most likely should do, what would be most effective. And I think part of this, obviously, living under bombs, bombs falling on your house, police outside your door ready to shoot you is a very different situation from the opportunity to go out and organize violence. But I think we have to talk with people about the incredible wealth of new information that is so little understood about the successes of nonviolence, most of which have been engaged in by non-Westerners, non-US citizens. These examples come from around the world of what succeeds, and it succeeds in new ways, and it succeeds, as David said, by having more people involved. You can get so many more people involved by doing something nonviolently. And the reason that you can achieve a success that will actually last more than a minute, that gets you to the next burst of violence, is because you achieve it without the bitter need for revenge and vengeance and blowback. Right? I mean, it's very hard to have a violent success that doesn't result in more violence. The last time they had a weapons parade in Washington, D.C. before Trump proposed one for next month was the Gulf War. Big success, the Gulf War, right? Which created September 11th, which created the sanctions and bombing of Iraq that led to the next version of what was called a new war. I mean, the war never ended. It's so you don't actually get successes with violence, whether you're talking about a success for the Pentagon or NATO, or a success for Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen or Libya or Somalia or Syria. And when you have the two nuclear monsters going after each other in Syria, there's a place for saying, I respectfully defer to the wisdom of the Syrian people to decide what to do. There's also a place for saying, we're all going to die if this goes wrong. We all have a say in this. And so let's talk about it. So we had several people before raise their hands and say sometimes war is justified. Could somebody who still wants to say that raise their hand and make the argument? Yeah.
I've got one more. So I almost did the PhD in political theory. So I think I've been trained to kind of deconstruct theory. Maybe most of you have heard of postmodernism, which is the kind of current age that we're in philosophically. And it basically says there's no such thing as a dogma that works across, all contexts. And so I bring that critique to this discussion for a moment. I think it's a mistake to say that anything is never the appropriate approach, or to say that anything always is. And I think that's true of war, defined as just the kind of organized execution of violence against people. But the way I make sense of it all is by thinking about it through kind of a yogic lens. I don't know how many people here are familiar with yoga, but in yoga there are forms of yoga for almost every kind of lifestyle. So you might have the yoga of peacemaking, or the yoga of violence, or the yoga of music, or the yoga of intellectuality, or what have you. It's a very flexible and fluid worldview. So just to give an example, I think of kind of how yoga might treat the question of violence. I think it would go deeper. Instead of trying to define the problem with the particular action, it might define it based on the motivation. So it might say, love, which ultimately can't really be defined either, but at least love is a more abstract and kind of encompassing concept than to strike somebody or to shoot somebody or what have you. They might say, listen, the act has to be motivated by love. It may be violent, it may be non-violent. So if you analyze what motivates acts of violence and say, you have to remove the anger. So yoga would say, remove the anger, remove the passion, the emotion. So Buddhism teaches that desire is the root of suffering, right? It's very similar. So you remove the kind of emotional addiction, so to speak, behind the act of violence. If you do that, then you suddenly start to realize that there's a spectrum here. I mean, anytime you discipline anybody, anytime a parent disciplines a child, grounds a child, says that he or she can't do this or that, it is an act of constraining, which is what violence is. You're taking a person's physical self and you're saying you can't do something that you want to do. So, you know, opening up the dialogue and saying that maybe anger is the problem, rather than the act itself.
Can I ask a question? Is slavery something that you couldn't say is never justified? Is slavery sometimes justified?
Again, it's a question of how you define it. Like, slavery really exists along a continuum.
Torturing children. Is torturing children something that you wouldn't want to generalize about?
I'm, especially as somebody local who does organizing, so I'm taking a risk by exposing my deep thinking about these topics, but I'm going to do it anyhow. I think that anytime you tell somebody they can't do something they want to do, in essence, you're engaged in a form of torture. You're saying, stop it.
Oh my God.
So someone wants to torture children, and I suggest they shouldn't do it. I'm torturing that person.
Listen, I am not at all saying that torture is justified. I'm just saying that, you know, when you break everything down, you end up having a hard time defining something as X or Y. And so I'm not saying that torture is justified. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to say that anything is always proscribed because of the way that it's hard to kind of make sense of what it is in reality. And I don't know what torture is, actually. I don't know what that means.
So in our society, I think a lot of people want to speak to this, but just to start it off, I think in our society, there are most people would not say rape is sometimes justified and sometimes not. There are things people are willing to say are not justifiable. And this used to include torture for most people. It still includes torturing non-humans, torturing kittens. It includes rape. It includes slavery. And so when you say war isn't one of those things, war is a thing that sometimes is justified, then I think you really have to explain what is that case. Because when people try to justify torture, they try to explain a case where it would be justified, and it's never believable. It's always this fantasy that couldn't possibly ever happen. You have to explain what is the case where war would be justified. Yeah.
So, for me, war is people who want control of natural resources or land or power or money or power, and then they convince and manipulate consciousness to move people, to divide them, and motivate them that there is some reason behind it. And that has been imprinted and passed down for hundreds and hundreds of years, that this group or these people are, that they're better than these other people, or that this is a right situation, and they go to war to defend something that has been imprinted and manipulated and controlled their brains and their emotions, that they're defending something good. And how do you break that barbaric manipulation and mind control and emotional control that is so imprinted and passed down to generations? How do you do that? Right. To where we know that we are a human community, that, you know, people deep inside of themselves, if they can peel that away, we know we're a family.
Okay, we'll try to answer that, but let's go over here.
Yeah, thank you.
How does one deal with the idea of humanitarian intervention? For example, during the civil war in the Congo in the early 1960s, there were a number of occasions